In recent years, issues related to the environment have been the subject of much debate among economists, ecologists, and politicians. This is a proof of a radical change in people's consciousness and sensitivity regarding this important subject for our survival. Talking about the environment implies talking about sustainable development, whose concept was defined in the second half of the 20th century. But what does sustainable development mean? A definition of sustainable development emerged for the first time in 1987 in a UN document, the Brundtland Report, drawn up by the UN World Commission on Environment and Development. In the report, sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. For the first time, interaction between environment and development was taken into account. The worst effects of this connection are closely linked to the extreme poverty of less developed countries, but are also related to an excessive consumption and development in the industrialized country. The report introduced a new idea of development that is able to ensure a balance between environmental protection, economic well-being, and social equity. So development is sustainable only when environmental, economic, and social requirements are fulfilled. Factors such as environmental degradation, population growth, and economic increase are having a negative impact on the environment, and this is threatening sustainable development. Environmental degradation is defined as the decay of environmental conditions and damage to ecosystem through the increase of agriculture and deforestation and the overexploitation of natural resources. Nowadays, agricultural sector is based on intensive farming and on the use of pesticides, which cause several damage, such as soil contamination, groundwater pollution. The agricultural and industrial activity mean deforestation, which in turn is linked to the phenomenon of habitat fragmentation, a method consisting in dividing the uncontaminated environments into several sectors by which man modifies and in this way damage the natural environment. Another threat to sustainable development is pollution and, of course, climate change, that are among the main topics being discussed at international level. As we know, the climate is changing, but nowadays the situation is quite alarming. Global warming, periods of drought, alternating with periods of flooding, more frequent and intense extreme events, are jeopardizing the environment and the entire economy. A first attempt to combat climate change was the Kyoto Protocol, international treaty entered into force in 2005. According to this protocol, state parties are committed to reducing their emission of greenhouse gases. Two other factors that definitely affect on biodiversity and consequently on sustainability are the exponential growth of the world population and the socio-economic issue. Population explosion implies significant changes in the environment from human activity. The consequences of this phenomenon are a reduction in green areas due to cropland, pastures, and industries, overexploitation of natural resources, and urbanization at the expense of natural landscapes. Regarding the socioeconomic issue that strongly compromises the future sustainable development, it is represented by the growing economic and social inequalities between the countries of the world. In the poorest regions, communities jeopardize biodiversity in order to sustain themselves and consume natural resources at a pace much faster than they can regenerate, while the inhabitants of industrialized countries consume a huge portion of energy, minerals, wood, and food. Protecting ecosystems mean, on one hand, ensure that developed countries start to exploit alternative energy sources and on the other, to support developing countries in promoting sustainable development patterns. A sequence of environmental disaster and an increase in social and political awareness of the environmental matter contributed to the emergence of the concept of sustainable development and to the implementation of several international agreements and conventions. between which we may remember the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, during which the issues addressed included equitable development, a greater involvement of people, alternative sources of energy to replace the use of fossil fuel, or the summit held in the same city, Rio de Janeiro, 20 years after the Earth Summit of 1992, also known as Rio Plus 20. One of the major outcomes of this summit included the definition of Sustainable Development Goals in place of the Millennium Development Goals that expired at the end of 2015. Moreover, last year the 21st Conference on Climate Change was held in Paris, which agreement sets up an action plan to curb the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. What emerged from the various conferences and agreements and the measures taken by the international community in recent decades is the importance and the need to use renewable energy sources to ensure sustainable development, which does not damage biodiversity and human health, but which does not jeopardize the economic growth of various countries. Renewable energy are intended to have an increasingly important role in environmental policies and in the life of every citizen, even if their use is the subject of discussion and controversy, despite the full knowledge that an increase in their use at the expense of energy derived from fossil fuels would bring benefits in many areas. In conclusion, sustainable development involves large investment in research by the states. The world today is facing a very complex challenge in which, on one side, the future of humanity and our planet are at risk. On the other side, the corporate interest and the radical, urgent and necessary change of modern man's habits.